Imagine a world lit only by fire, a world where empires are born and die by the sword. Now, picture a young man, not yet 25, standing on the shores of a foreign land. Before him lies the most powerful kingdom on earth, the invincible empire of Persia, a leviathan that stretches from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. Behind him stands an army of 40,000 souls, bound not by a nation, but by faith in one person, him. His name is Alexander. He does not wait for the enemy to come to him. He does not fortify his position. Instead, he does the unthinkable. He orders his entire army to march, not towards the enemy, but along the enemy coast. A blatant provocation, a challenge thrown at the feet of a god king. The Persian war council, hearing of this audacity, laughs. Their admiral, Memnon, a Greek himself, warns them. Do not underestimate this boy, he says, his voice grave. He does not think like other men. He fights with his mind as much as his sword. But they do not listen. And so, on a narrow plain by the river Granicus, the stage is set for the first act of a drama that would echo through millennia. Alexander, a flash of white plumage on his legendary black horse, Bucephalus, charges not at the center, but directly at the Persian high command, a spearhead of personal vengeance aimed at the heart of the enemy line. Why would a king risk his own life in the first moments of the first battle? What kind of man inspires such fanatical loyalty that his men would follow him to the end of the known world? And what hidden currents, what secrets of his soul, drove him to conquer everything, only to be left with nothing? This is not just a story of battles and dates. This is the story of Alexander the Great, a tale of fire, ambition, and the terrifying price of destiny. We will unravel the myths, explore the hidden truths, and walk in the footsteps of the man who would become a god. Background history: the forge of a king. To understand the fire, we must first look to the spark. Alexander was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the ancient kingdom of Macedonia. His father was King Philip II, a military genius in his own right, a man who had transformed a backward, fractious kingdom into the dominant power in Greece. His mother was Olympias, a princess from the wild land of Epirus, a woman of fierce intelligence and terrifying piety, who claimed her son was not sired by Philip, but by Zeus, king of the gods, in the form of a thunderbolt. From his earliest days, Alexander was caught between these two colossal forces, his father's ruthless, practical ambition and his mother's divine, consuming mysticism. It was a tension that would define his life. Philip was his first and greatest teacher. He hired the philosopher Aristotle, the finest mind in the world, to tutor the young prince. For 3 years, Alexander immersed himself in Homer's Iliad, philosophy, medicine, and science. Aristotle gave him a vision of a world beyond Macedonia, a world where Greek culture and reason could civilize the barbarians. Alexander's copy of the Iliad, annotated by Aristotle himself, would become his lifelong companion, a guide to heroism and rage. But it was on the battlefield where Philip's lessons truly took root. Alexander witnessed his father's revolutionary army, the Sarissa-wielding phalanx, a forest of 18-foot spears that presented an impenetrable wall of sharpened steel, the disciplined, heavy cavalry and the combined arms tactics that made the Macedonian war machine unstoppable. At the age of just 16, while Philip was away on campaign, Alexander was left as regent. When a Thracian tribe rebelled, he did not wait. He marched out, crushed the rebellion, and founded his first city, Alexandropolis, named after himself. The pattern was set. The relationship between father and son was a stormy one. At Philip's wedding to a new, younger wife, a drunken uncle of the bride toasted the union, hoping it would produce a legitimate heir. Alexander, enraged, threw his cup at the man. "You villain," he shouted. "What, am I then a bastard?" Philip, stumbling drunk, drew his sword to charge his own son, but tripped and fell. Alexander looked down at the most powerful man in Greece, sprawled on the floor. "See now, men," he sneered, "a man who prepares to cross from Europe to Asia, who cannot even cross from one couch to another." The rift was complete. Alexander and Olympias fled into exile. Though they later reconciled, the damage was done. In 336 BC, at the wedding of his daughter, Philip II was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards. The court erupted in chaos. Enemies circled. The Greek city-states, chafing under Macedonian rule, saw their chance for rebellion. At just 20 years old, Alexander ascended to a throne surrounded by wolves. He moved with a speed and ruthlessness that stunned the world. He eliminated any potential rivals with terrifying efficiency. Then, he marched south to Greece. He found the city of Thebes in open revolt. He offered them a chance to surrender. They refused, trusting in their fortified walls. Alexander's response was swift and absolute. He stormed the city, razed it to the ground, and sold its entire population into slavery, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. The message was clear: cross the new king, and face annihilation. The rest of Greece fell silent, and fast. The forge of his youth, the intellectual rigor, the military genius, the parental conflict, the brutal consolidation of power had created a weapon of unparalleled sharpness. And now, with a pacified Greece at his back and his father's battle-hardened army at his command, Alexander turned his eyes east, towards the ancient, sprawling empire of Persia. The eagle was about to take flight. Part 2. The Breaking of the World. Hidden Facts. The march begins. Many believe Alexander's war against Persia was a simple matter of revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. But the truth is more complex, and more personal. Philip II had already planned the invasion. It was his grand design. For Alexander, it was about more than finishing his father's work. It was about surpassing him. It was about proving his own divine destiny, a destiny his mother had whispered to him since birth. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He did not simply disembark. In a moment of profound symbolism, he sailed to the site of ancient Troy. While his general, Parmenion, organized the army, Alexander ran naked to the tomb of the hero Achilles, anointed himself with oil, and laid wreath. He took from the temple a sacred shield and a set of armors said to be from the Trojan War. He was not just a king invading an empire, he was a hero stepping out of myth, reenacting the epic of his literary idol. This was a masterstroke of propaganda, a hidden fact that reveals the core of Alexander's character. He was crafting his own legend, in real time. Days later, at the Granicus River, we see the first glimpse of his tactical insanity, a brilliance that bordered on recklessness. The Persian satraps had positioned their army on the far, steep bank of the river. Their best cavalry was at the front, their Greek mercenary hoplites behind. It was a strong defensive position. Parmenion, the cautious old general, advised a delay, to wait for morning. Alexander dismissed him. "I would be ashamed," he is said to have replied, "if, after crossing the Hellespont, this little stream detained us." He launched an immediate, direct cavalry charge straight into the heart of the Persian line. The battle was a chaotic melee of swirling dust and screaming men. Alexander himself was the tip of the spear. A Persian noble, Spithridates, swung a battle axe at his head, shearing off his helmet plume and striking a blow that would have killed him had it connected fully. In that split second, as Alexander struggled, another Persian noble, Zaces, brought his own axe down on Alexander's head, cracking his helmet and stunning him. As the king swayed in his saddle, about to be struck down, his childhood friend, Clytus the Black, lunged forward and speared Spithridates through the chest, saving Alexander's life. The victory was total. To send a message, Alexander treated the captured Greek mercenaries who had fought for Persia not as soldiers, but as traitors. Thousands were sent back to Macedonia in chains. The message was clear: Greece was united under him, and those who sided with the barbarian would share their fate. The campaign that followed was a masterclass in psychological and military warfare. At the city of Gordium, he encountered the legendary Gordian knot, an intricate tangle of cornel bark tied to an ancient wagon. An oracle prophesied that whoever could untie the knot would become the king of all Asia. For days, Alexander studied the problem. The hidden layers were complex. It was a test of patience, intellect, and legitimacy. He did not spend weeks trying to unpick it. He simply drew his sword and, with a single, decisive stroke, cut through it. That night, thunder and lightning erupted in the sky. His propagandists declared it a sign from the gods. The prophecy was fulfilled. He had solved an unsolvable problem not with convention, but with sheer, audacious force of will. It was the story of his life, written in a single gesture. Dramatic turning point, the God King's test. By 333 BC, the Persian king of kings, Darius III, finally took the field himself. He assembled a colossal army, perhaps over 100,000 strong, and maneuvered it into a narrow coastal plain near Issus, behind Alexander's lines, cutting off his southerly route. It was a brilliant strategic move. Alexander was trapped. His army, outnumbered at least 2 to 1, was forced to turn and fight on a battlefield chosen by the enemy, a constricted plain between the sea and mountains, where his cavalry could not easily maneuver. The moment Alexander saw the vast Persian host, glittering with gold and silk, he knew this was the decisive moment, but he also saw its weakness. Darius, believing himself secure in his divine majesty, had placed himself in the center, surrounded by his royal guard. But the narrow terrain had compressed his army, making its numerical advantage a liability. The two armies clashed. The Macedonian phalanx, a bristling wall of sarissas, slammed into the Persian center. The noise was deafening, the clash of bronze and iron, the screams of men and horses. Alexander, leading his companion cavalry on the right wing, did not engage the cavalry opposite him. Instead, he executed a breathtaking, oblique charge, driving like a wedge directly towards the spot where Darius himself stood in his magnificent chariot. He was creating a killing blow aimed at the head of the snake. The fighting around Darius was ferocious. The Persian nobles fought with the desperation of men protecting their god king. Alexander, a white-plumed demon on his black stallion, was everywhere. His spear a blur. The Macedonian infantry, sensing victory, pressed forward with grim determination. Then, something broke. Perhaps it was the sight of his bodyguards being slaughtered around him. Perhaps it was the terrifying, blood-streaked visage of Alexander himself, locked in combat only yards away. Darius, the king of kings, the great king, the ruler of the world, panicked. He turned his chariot and fled the field, abandoning his army, his family, and his royal treasure. The Persian line dissolved into a rout. The greatest empire in the world had been defeated by a king not yet 23 years old. In the aftermath, Alexander entered the captured Persian camp. He walked into the royal tent, a pavilion of unimaginable luxury. There, he found Darius's mother, Sisygambis, his wife, Statra, and his children. They fell at the feet of the man they assumed was the Macedonian king's chief attendant, mistaking the taller, more regal Hephaestion for Alexander. As the courtiers recoiled in horror, fearing a deadly insult, Alexander merely smiled. He walked over to Hephaestion and put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "Do not be troubled, mother," he said gently to Sisygambis, "for he, too, is Alexander." It was a moment of breathtaking magnanimity and political genius. He promised them they would be treated as royalty, their honor intact. This act secured his moral and political high ground. He was no longer just a barbarian invader, he was a civilized ruler, a worthy successor. The victory at Issus was not just a military triumph, it was the moment Alexander began to transform from a Greek avenger into a Persian emperor. Part 3. The Labyrinth of Godhood. Mysteries, the Oracle and the Oasis. Flush with victory, Alexander continued his march south. into Phoenicia. Most cities submitted, but the powerful island city of Tyre refused. They offered nominal loyalty but would not allow him to sacrifice at their temple of Melkart, whom Alexander associated with his divine ancestor, Heracles. For Alexander, this was not a political snub, it was a personal and religious insult. The siege of Tyre that followed was one of the most audacious military engineering feats in history. The city was on an island half a mile offshore, with massive walls and a powerful navy. Alexander's decision? He would build a causeway, a mole, from the mainland to the island. For 7 months, his army worked, fighting off Tyrian attacks, battling the elements, and using the very rubble of the old mainland city as building material. It was a brutal, grinding affair. At one point, the Tyrians launched a fire ship or vessel packed with combustible azure that destroyed the siege towers on the mole. Alexander simply rebuilt. He was like a force of nature, incapable of being denied. When the mole finally reached the walls, and his fleet, borrowed from other Phoenician cities, broke the naval blockade, the city fell. In a grim echo of his father's rage at Thebes, Alexander executed thousands of Tyrians and sold the rest into slavery. The message was repeated: resistance to his divine will was futile. From Tyre, he marched into Egypt. The Persians, hated overlords, were swiftly expelled. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. Here, Alexander did something that continues to baffle and fascinate historians. He journeyed deep into the Libyan desert, to the remote oasis of Siwa, home to the legendary oracle of Ammon's Zeus. Why? What question was so burning that he would risk the perilous journey across hundreds of miles of trackless desert? The historical accounts are shrouded in mystery. Some say his guide was a talking serpent. Others speak of life-saving rains sent by the gods. When he finally reached the stunning green oasis and the temple, he entered the inner sanctum alone. The high priest, according to tradition, greeted him not as son of Philip, but as Paidios, a son of Zeus. What was asked, and what was answered, Alexander never revealed. He merely stated that he had received the answer he sought. From that day forward, he began to openly style himself as the son of Zeus Ammon. The rumor spread through his army and the world. Alexander was not merely a king, he was a living god. This was a profound turning point for his Macedonian veterans, raised on tales of mortal heroes. This was a step too far. Their king was becoming foreign, alien, intoxicated with Eastern mysticism and his own divinity. The seeds of future conflict were sown in the sands of Siwa. Dramatic turning point. The final clash and the burning of Persepolis. Leaving Egypt, Alexander marched east, deeper into the heart of the Persian Empire. Darius had assembled a new, even larger army, on a wide plain at Gaugamela, chosen specifically to nullify Alexander's tactical advantages. He had scythed chariots with whirling blades on the wheels, war elephants, and cavalry from the farthest reaches of his empire. The night before the battle, Parmenion again cancelled a night attack, to offset the Persian numerical superiority. Alexander refused. "I will not steal victory," he declared. He would win in open, honorable combat, a testament to his divine favor and military genius. On October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies met. Darius's forces stretched to the horizon. Alexander, again outnumbered perhaps 5-1, did not charge. He advanced obliquely, forcing the Persian line to shift, to stretch, to create a gap. He used his entire army as a single, cohesive instrument. When the Persian scythed chariots charged, his men simply parted their ranks, letting them pass through to be dispatched by reserves, then closed ranks again. Then, as Odysseus, Alexander saw his moment. A gap opened in the Persian line. He formed his companion cavalry into a perfect wedge and, with Bucephalus beneath him, charged directly for Darius's position. It was a repeat of Issus, but but on a grander, more terrifying scale. The shock of the charge was immense. Once again, Darius saw death coming for him in the form of the Macedonian king, and once again, his nerve failed. He turned and fled. With their king gone, the Persian army collapsed. The victory at Gaugamela was absolute. The gates of the empire were thrown open. Alexander marched triumphantly to Babylon, then to Susa, and finally to the ceremonial capital of the empire, Persepolis. For months, he occupied the city, a place of unimaginable wealth and splendor. Then, during a drunken revel, something happened. The Athenian courtesan Thetilda Macrones, a companion of his general Ptolemy, allegedly stood up and gave a fiery speech, urging Alexander to burn the great palace as revenge for the Persian burning of Athens 150 years earlier. A torch was thrown. The dry, cedar-lined halls of the palace of Xerxes went up in flames. Was it a calculated act of political symbolism, the final destruction of the old order, or was it a drunken, impulsive act of vandalism that Alexander came to regret? The next morning, according to sources, he looked upon the smoldering ruins with deep remorse. The fire at Persepolis remains one of the great mysteries of his campaign, a moment of profound destruction that marked the end of the Achaemenid Persian Empire and the absolute ascendancy of Alexander, now the undisputed Lord of Asia. Part 4. The Edge of the World and the Shadow of Death. The cost of ambition. The world was now his. But for Alexander, it was not enough. He pursued the fleeing Darius, only to find him murdered by his own satraps, led by a man named Bessus. Alexander gave Darius a royal funeral and declared himself the avenger of the dead king. He now set his sights on the wild, unconquered lands to the east, Bactria and Sogdia. This campaign, in modern-day Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, was a brutal, grueling guerrilla war. It was here that the cracks in Alexander's perfect world began to show. The strain of constant campaigning, the cultural gulf growing between him and his Macedonian veterans, and his increasing adoption of Persian dress and customs, bred deep resentment. The tension exploded at a feast in Maracanda. Alexander's friend, Clytus the Black, the very man who had saved his life at the Granicusa, was now his senior commander. Wine flowed freely, and the conversation turned to Philip too. Clytus, drunk and bitter, began praising Philip's achievements, implicitly criticizing Alexander's new, godlike status and his preference for Persian flatterers. The argument grew heated. Alexander, enraged, seized a spear from a guard. In a blind fury, he ran Clytus through, killing the man who had once been his savior. The moment the deed was done, Alexander's rage turned to horror. He tried to pull the spear from his friend's body to turn it on himself, but was restrained by his guards. For 3 days, he lay in his tent, weeping and refusing food, racked with the guilt that would never leave him. The god king was still a man, capable of monstrous, human error, yet, he pushed on. He married a Bactrian princess, Roxana, to cement his political control, a move seen by his men as further proof he was going native. He fought his way through the Hindu Kush and, in 326 BC, descended into the unknown subcontinent of India. At the mighty river Hydaspes, now the Jhelum in Pakistan, he faced his last great set-piece battle against King Porus, a giant of a man who commanded a vast army reinforced with war elephants. The battle was another masterpiece of tactics. In a torrential monsoon rain, Alexander divided his forces, crossed the swollen river miles upstream, and defeated Porus in a hard-fought contest. Impressed by Porus's valor, Alexander asked him how he wished to be treated as a king. Porus replied. Alexander, respecting his courage, not only restored his kingdom but enlarged it. But here, at the peak of his power on the banks of the Hydaspes, his army finally broke. They had marched over 11,000 miles. They were at the edge of the known world. Rumors spoke of vast kingdoms and armies with thousands more elephants beyond the next river, the Ganges. The rain never stopped. The men were exhausted, diseased, and homesick. They refused to go further. Alexander, the invincible general, was defeated not by an enemy, but by the wills of his own men. He sulked in his tent for 3 days, like Achilles, but the army would not budge. The dream of reaching the outer ocean was over. It was the most bitter disappointment of his life. Powerful conclusions. The last breath of an empire. The return journey was a tragedy. Alexander led his army south down the Indus River, fighting a bloody campaign against fierce tribes. In one assault on a town of the Mali, in a fit of his old recklessness, he scaled the wall alone and jumped inside, followed by only 3 men. He found himself isolated, a king trapped in an enemy citadel. The Indian arrow, fired from point-blank range, pierced his lung. His men, in a frenzy, broke down the gates just in time to see him collapse, blood gushing from the wound. A rumor swept the army that the king was dead. Panic ensued. He survived, but he was never the same. The physical wound weakened him, and the psychological blow of his army's mutiny and his own near-death changed him. He was forced to turn back, leading a part of his army on a horrific march through the Gedrosian desert, modern Kran in Iran, where thousands perished from heat and thirst, a march that seemed like a penance for his failures. He returned to Babylon in 323 BC. He was now the master of an empire that stretched from the Adriatic Sea to the Indus River. He began ambitious plans for new campaigns into Arabia, and for the consolidation of his vast realm, promoting fusion between his Macedonian and Persian subjects. But the fire that had driven him for 13 years was burning out. In June of 323 BC, after a series of banquets, he was struck by a sudden fever. It grew worse day by day. His robust constitution, hardened by a lifetime of campaigning, was failing. His men, desperate for a last sight of their king, filed past his bed. He could no longer speak, but he acknowledged each one with a movement of his eyes. On June 11, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, Alexander the Great, king of Macedon, Gaugamela of Greece, pharaoh of Egypt, and lord of Asia, died. He was 32 years old. The mystery of his death remains one of history's greatest enigmas. Was it malaria, typhoid, West Nile virus, or was it poison, a conspiracy by those who feared his next impossible ambition? We will never know for sure. His death created a vacuum that plunged the world into 40 years of war, as his generals, the Diadochi, tore his empire apart. The legacy he left was not a unified world, but a Hellenistic Neo world where Greek culture was spread from the Mediterranean to India, influencing art, science, and government for centuries to come. So, was Alexander the greatest general in history? He was never defeated in battle. He conquered the known world with speed and brilliance that defy belief. He fused tactics, strategy, logistics, and psychological warfare into an art form. He led from the front, shared his men's hardships, and inspired a loyalty that pushed them to the ends of the earth. But his story is also a cautionary tale. His insatiable ambition cost him his health, his friendships, and ultimately, his life. He built an empire with his own hands that crumbled the moment he let it go. He sought to become a god, but in the end, he was tragically, powerfully, devastatingly human. He was a hurricane of a man, who changed the map of the world and the course of history, not by ruling wisely from a throne, but by riding, always riding, towards the next horizon, until there were no horizons left. And that is why, more than 2,000 years later, we still whisper his name with a mixture of awe, admiration, and pity. Alexander the Great.